Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in today. On behalf of the University of California, San Francisco Alumni Association, the UCSF Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, welcome to the second webinar in our series titled Emotional Well-Being in 2021. This week's topic is anti-racism and building an inclusive culture. I will now turn it over to our host, Dr. Alyssa Eppel.
We are so happy to be here talking about anti-racism and taking a really close look at our own lives and own settings. And I'm going to provide you with one of the best examples I know of how to start on a trajectory of big change. So if we were a year and a half ago, I wouldn't be leading this webinar. We're here because of the race equity movement. After George Floyd's murder, things changed for most of us whites like me who thought we really understood racism. And once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. The personal and systemic racism that has so pervasively shaped our lives and societal structures, we're just swimming in the matrix. And sometimes it's hard to see what you're swimming in. This includes the systemic racism in healthcare, research, and academia. But once we get a glimpse into the systemic nature of racism, we see that we're actually an active player in it. We're part of a system, part of a community, and the change is left to each of us to do and to do together. And it becomes a moral imperative. We're not immune here in the liberal Bay Area, in academia, in our own university. We have around 106 Black faculty out of 2,000. It hurts to name that, but this is about looking honestly and carefully at the facts. In our own department, our Black members experience racism at home. Around 50% of them, whether it's going into a hospital or into a workplace, the microaggressions, et cetera, that they experience are something that we now know about. We now know about because we've surveyed our faculty very carefully. We want to talk to you about that today. So I planned this session with my colleagues, Michelle Porsche and Lisa Fortuna. Lisa Fortuna has been a guiding light to us through this pandemic, through her many talks. You can see she leads the second webinar of this series in 2020. And she has talked to us about things like racial trauma and avoiding racial triggers. So we realized we really wanted to hear, there's a lot on anti-racism. We wanted to hear an example of what you can do in your own healthcare system setting department. So we looked around and the answer was really right in front of us. And that was bringing in our chair, a very famous geneticist. He's not here because of his genetics expertise, but we brought in Matt State to talk about what he has done in our department, partnering with our faculty member, Michelle Porsche. And they've created a Black study group. So as Rhonda McGee has said, every discipline needs its own reckoning, and we're sharing part of ours. In the mental health field, there is such little representation of Black therapists, clinicians, researchers. So we noticed this during the race equity movement, the greater impact on our Black colleagues here. We had so few Black therapists to help serve them. And our host here, John McCoy, who introduces every webinar, he is, one of his changes post-pandemic is he's going into the mental health field and becoming a therapist to help serve the Black community. So this is an invitation into our own home, our own workplace, and the dialogue we're having. It's not a one-time conversation. It's one we intend to keep alive. So I'd like to introduce my colleagues who are leading this with me. Michelle Porsche. She's an associate professor in our Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She has 2 masters in counseling and psych and a doctorate of education from Harvard. She's an expert in quantitative and mixed methods. Welcome, Michelle, come online. She's done many studies on child trauma support and academic outcomes. I want to read the title of a paper that she did this year with Lisa Fortuna, Marina Toulouchams, our colleagues in our department. The title was Inequity and the Disproportionate Impact of COVID-19 on Communities of Color in the United States. And I'd like to introduce Matt State, the Obendorf Family Distinguished Professor and Chair. He got his MD from Stanford, PhD in genetics from Yale, and he leads international collaborative genomic studies of autism, Tourette's, and other brain disorders. He's discovered many genes, both rare as well as risky genes. And he's here because he is an example of a white upstander, not a white ally, but actually someone who stepped forward to say, what can we do? And listened to people and has started us on a trajectory of change. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Rhonda McGee. Rhonda is the professor of law here at the University of San Francisco. She's the author of a very, very popular book. You can barely buy it on Amazon because it keeps selling out. It's called The Inner Work of Racial Justice. She's an internationally recognized thought leader on integrating mindfulness into higher education law and social change. She's developed the concept of color insight instead of color blindness and has published papers on that, such as Color Insight, Understanding Race and Law Effectively Using Mindfulness-Based Practices. She is one of the most skillful teachers and facilitators I have ever worked with. I've had the honor of leading retreats with her and working through Mind and Life with her. Welcome, Rhonda. And wanted to thank Lisa Fortuna, who planned our session with us. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Rhonda. We would just love to hear a little bit about your experience in this work in the long game that we're in.
Wow, thank you so very much, my dear friend, Dr. Apple, Alyssa, and really everyone here from this really esteemed team at UCSF. It's an honor to be with you. And we are coming together, of course, with a focus on exploring how it is that we, each of us, can do our part to support what Alyssa referred to as the reckoning with racism that so many of us have been turning toward over the course of the last year in particular, and in response to or in the wake of the very public murder of George Floyd in the United States. And as I might as well say, we're meeting today. We happen to be meeting today on the day that the sentencing for Officer Chauvin came down. So my heart is beating as I talk to you because these matters that we have brought into focus, looking at the legacies of racism and the call, a deeper call that Alyssa, Dr. Apple was mentioning, having sort of heard and having responded to over the last year. This deeper call to turn toward rather than away from a conversation about racism that goes deeper perhaps than it ever has and really challenges us in ways perhaps that we have not been challenged before. We're all in the midst of this, and we're all perhaps in our own ways. I mean, some of us have been engaged in looking at race and racism all of our lives by virtue of our experiences, our backgrounds. I can say that certainly has been more or less true for me as an African-American, a Black racialized woman growing up here in the United States, born in the South, in a community in which the legacies of the histories that we talk about, that we're more and more courageously naming as the systems of white supremacy and their ongoing imprint. So segregated communities and schools. Those are ideas and concepts, but they're also things that we've lived. And I can say as a person who was born in the United States in North Carolina in 1967, though the Supreme Court had outlawed segregated schooling some years before in the Brown versus Board of Education case, by the time I went to school, even in the 1970s, the public schools were still officially segregated. That's North Carolina, you might say. What does that necessarily have to do with California? Well, some of you may know that right here in San Francisco, in our beloved progressive city, we certainly have a long and deep history of commitment, frankly, to policies, procedures, ways of organizing our lives that support the maintenance of white supremacy. And so all of us, wherever we are, and certainly even here in San Francisco, are given this opportunity to come together and reflect on what we know and what we might know more deeply and richly about how the legacies of white supremacy are in and shaping our institutions, have shaped our disciplines, have shaped the communities we live in. And from knowing more, how we might do better in alignment with our commitments to really make a more just and equitable world in which everybody can really flourish. And I want to just name a little bit of additional particularity right here in San Francisco, where I happen to live. You know, I live in a community in the Monterey Heights part of town, you know, not far from Sherwood Forest, which is famously historically as a place where doctors, including doctors from UCSF, have lived. All of these neighborhoods were officially restricted against having people like me move in through racially restrictive covenants that were endorsed, supported by buyers and sellers in these neighborhoods, not just through the late 1940s, at which time the Supreme Court outlawed those covenants, but even beyond that, into the 50s, into the early 60s, even again, after the law has said they were illegal, members of the San Francisco elite and home buying communities decided to continue to enforce those covenants and to keep people like me out of neighborhoods like this. And not just people like me, lowly, professors at USF. Willie Mays, as many of you may know, was one of the more famous African-Americans who sought to move in, actually less than 3/10 of a mile from where I'm living and sitting right now, and who literally had to bear the brunt of this kind of racism. So, my friends, I'm saying that when we talk about racism, we're not talking about that thing that's, over there in the South. And we're also not only talking about those policies and practices of decades ago, because they actually have shaped the communities that we're in, have shaped some of the ways we think about each other, and have shaped the ways that we engage in our professional roles, me in the field of law, you all in the field of healthcare. And so what I'd like to offer at this moment is an opportunity for us to come together, feeling the support of meditation practices, compassion practices, a kind of invitation then for a whole body support as we engage in this work. We know, research has shown us that looking closely at issues of identity, issues of cognitive bias, really calls on us to do more than merely intellectualize, because we've become really easily aware, readily aware that our whole bodies are in this. We're having emotional reactions to some of the things I've even mentioned in this call so far. You might notice what's happening in the body when I invite reflection on segregation in our communities. What do you know from your experience about segregation in a community you've lived in before you came to San Francisco? What do you know about how the community you live in the Bay Area, whether it's San Francisco or beyond, how that community, wherever it is, perhaps in the US, how is it that your communities you live in were formed? And what are some of the ways that literally we've been formed in environments that have formed in us biases? So pausing to recognize that we all know something about this, and that when we come together to look at this closely, more than our brains are involved, and really sort of creating a spacious, gentle willingness to be present to the multidimensionality of what is arising when we come together around these topics. in my own work and research, I've looked at how meditation can be a really important support. So integrating all of the beautiful wisdom around meditation and the research around neuroscience into this work of anti-racism. So what I'd like to do is invite us to take a moment and pause and just feel the ground beneath us as a support for our being together in reflection in the next few minutes. We'll just do a short meditation in which we feel our bodies in this moment, the support of the ground beneath us, the chair that we're sitting on, or however we happen to be holding our bodies in this moment. Allowing ourselves to feel as we breathe in and out, the connection to the floor, and through that connection to the earth that we all share in this moment and in every moment that we've ever lived or will. As we breathe in and out and notice the way in which the body breathing has its own wisdom about how to downregulate when we're feeling emotionally distressed. So just feeling our way into the natural self-regulating capacities that our neurobiology has formed in us, and leaning into that as a support for noticing our reactivity, noticing the threat sensors being activated by this conversation, and inviting a kind of a gentle willingness to just create a little bit more spaciousness within yourself, to see more of what's here without judgment, without restriction, or let's say with as little judgment as possible as we create the space for learning and growing together. So breathing in and out, noticing any way in which you're feeling any tension, and perhaps on the next in-breath, noticing also what is well within you. And on the out-breath, expanding the wish for wellness into those areas where we're feeling tight, and allowing a release and a letting go, coming back to the sense of being at home and at ease here on the earth. And so we might, as we transition from this moment of meditation, imagine a thread supporting us from this whole body awareness of our sort of inherent belonging on the earth, the way that we are able when we relax to feel the support of being here together, to feel maybe a little bit more openness to hearing from people whose experiences differ from ours. May we take a thread of this resourcing meditation that we've just done and allow it to be a conscious support for us as we turn toward this work. This is the work of my own commitment and passion over the last 20 years or so, culminating in this book, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Strengthening, Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness. But it's really an invitation that I offer us to come into in each in our own way, holistically engaging these questions of anti-racism and what we can do from where we are to make a difference. So thank you so much for sitting with me, and I want to turn it back over to Alyssa to invite us in.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. That
Thank
was
you.
so needed. Thank you. I would like to remember to always breathe like that so that I can think better and more clearly and not so automatically and reactively. And especially on this topic where I think we're always worried that we'll say the wrong thing and have blind spots. And I certainly get a very ruminative mind. So I would love to introduce back Michelle Porsche and Matt State. And we just would love to hear you talk about how this Black Study report came to be. It is on our website for anyone to look at, especially the executive summary. And it's an incredibly in-depth report, the different parts on surveying our Black members, listening to them and providing recommendations. Okay, so I'll stop there and turn it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Maybe I want to start by saying, much appreciation for this opportunity to really have a conversation with Matt. We've done all of this work and we just don't have time to take the time out to really talk about the process. And, I think that's a good focus for us for our time together. Just a little bit about myself. Used to introduce myself as an African American of mixed race. My family are all from Louisiana, so I'm Creole, which means I have descendants of enslaved people and of slave owners. I also want to point out colorism, because that's a big part of this too. I have skin privilege as a lighter skinned Black woman. We got into a little bit of that, explored a little bit of that in our focus groups. But I think that's one thing I want us to keep in mind too when we think about the results. And let me just say a little bit about what we did. We surveyed the whole department. We did have certain sections of the survey that were really more focused on Black faculty, staff, trainees, and students. And then questions that were for everybody together. We were also able to have focus group interviews with, we had 12 different focus group interviews, and some of those were with Black identified faculty, staff, and trainees, and some of them were just with mixed groups of white employees and employees from other racial and ethnic backgrounds. And those really gave us a lot of rich information about what was going on. And I also want to say this all happened during a pandemic, and it has really been just about 1 year since we started this. So I think a lot has happened in a year, and maybe a good start is to Matt, what were you thinking about when you came up with this initiative?
Great, thanks. And thanks, Alyssa, for organizing this, and Lisa for helping to think about how to shape this, and Michelle for inviting me to talk about this. I lead a department in a school of medicine that is committed to health equity and the public mission, and it's a part of my job, and an important part of my job to think about how we can advance that, but at the same time, in the midst of a pandemic, when we were struggling to try to figure out sort of how to keep things going and transition care and everything else, that the murder of George Floyd was just profoundly impactful for me as a leader. And I'll do my own version of what Alyssa said at the start of this, that part of that reaction, there was also a sense kind of shame about having that reaction at that moment, and feeling an intense need as a leader to try to respond to that in more than just platitudes about our commitment as a department to public health and the public mission and community service. It immediately spawned a lot of self-reflection about and recognition that this was an ongoing serious problem, that as chair, I just had not, I felt immediately both this kind of called need to act in the face of kind of those, horrific circumstances, and my awareness of that, and also, being aware that I was really late to the game. And despite having a really active diversity, equity, inclusion program in the department, and feeling like that we were really trying to push ahead in that area, we have great leadership in that area, I also felt like there were gaping holes in what I understood about what was going on, and that I needed to do something, as I said, that wasn't just a statement from the chair that, that we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so in the face of that, it felt like the first thing to do was to start asking questions. I have to say, I got introduced as a geneticist. I'm also a child psychiatrist. I'm actually first a child psychiatrist and then a geneticist. And, sort of the importance when you're faced with a problem, whether it's a clinical problem or scientific problem or anything else, of just starting to try to find where you can listen, where you can understand, where you can try to get some purchase on someone's experience was really important. And so one of the first things I did was to turn to Lisa and Michelle to start asking questions with the idea that I needed to support something that was gonna that would help us act as a department. And it seemed like the very first step was having a conversation, but also trying to do something that would really increase certainly my understanding. And I really felt like it was very likely that there were similar gaping holes in the understanding of other members of the department about the experience, particularly of the Black members of our community, faculty, staff, and trainees. And that's sort of came up with the idea that we ought to really do a deep dive on that. But much of it was in conversation, honestly, with you about how to begin.
I have to say, I had some advantage in doing some work like this prior. I've done a lot of research on, understanding racial identity development, looking at microaggressions and how those interrupt STEM trajectories for Black and Latino high school students. So, this was in my wheelhouse, definitely, to look at that. And at the time, I felt so immobilized by what was happening that this was an opportunity to have an active involvement in something that might make a difference. And to our credit, I think timing is everything. And I think two things that really stand out for me was that we had actually had a meal together before this. So I felt like I could really trust you. That was really important. And I also felt like as a new person in the department, I could reach out to a lot of people and they might be, more frank with me because they didn't know me and they, could trust me or not. But one of the things that I would say often, especially in the focus groups, was I really want to hear you. This is confidential. We really want to know the truth. And I truly believe the chair really wants to hear this. You don't have to hold back. So, those things were just really important. And just to say a little bit about what we found, half of the people responding to the survey, and that means, across race, ethnicity, we're saying that they had either experienced themselves or witnessed anti-Black racism. Our Black faculty, staff, and trainees reported experiencing racial slurs and microaggressions from patients. People were really in pain. I got that in doing those focus groups. There's a lot of talk about pay inequity and retention issues, and people who said I considered leaving. And I said this to Matt a number of times. This is a gift that people gave. They were really honest about how they were feeling, because a lot of people, and I'll say me included, leave institutions without saying anything. Knowledge is power, and I might feel like I don't even want to share how I'm feeling about the racism that I'm experiencing. So, this is really valuable. And some folks may think, why did we focus on anti-Black racism? Yes, it was very much in relation to the murder of George Floyd. But so often we've been, many people I know, Lisa can attest to this too. We're in, I'm sure Rhonda as well, you might be in a discussion that's supposed to focus on racism, and it will quickly devolve into gender issues or SES or anything else, because to really talk about racism is really painful, and we really need to get an understanding of white supremacist systems that really divide us. They're hurtful for everybody, and they really stop us from bringing all we are, all our gifts to work. You know, I just want to say, you know, what we uncovered in this report was a lot of, I think, racial trauma, most of it psychological, but that has long-term impact on our health. And, you know, one of the ways we address that is through having these opportunities to really talk honestly about what's going on, and then to think about remedy. I think what was so important about what we did was the agreement that I would gather this information through this Black study group, thanks to the members of the group and also the liaisons who really helped with, you know, pulling together the design of the survey, getting people to participate in focus groups. So it was a group effort. I just had a little bit more expertise in social science research to be able to pull it off. But the agreement is to get this report, which included recommendations from the people who participated, and give it back to Matt and the executive committee to begin to work on remedy. Like, what are we going to do now? And so, you know, maybe to hand it back to Matt to talk about, you know, what's going on, because so many people said, is this just going to be another thing where you write a report and it gets filed away? And, you know, so I gave all my street cred to say, no, it's something's going to happen. And we can talk about a little bit later too about, I think there are some things that are happening already, even if they're not formalized.
So, well, there's a lot in what you said. I'll start with the last question and just say, I felt the same way, right? It was really important at the start to not have this be another committee where, you know, a report is generated and gets filed somewhere, and then 5 years from now, you know, the issue raises again, and it's like, oh yeah, I think we did a report on that 5 years ago. So there was no question in terms of the intention of this, and it's part of, as you know, how we designed it, which was to really focus on sort of on this initial study in a time limited way, and thanks to your advice about how to do that, how to organize it, incredibly valuable, but to really make that time delimited and to have an explicit commitment that once that was done, that there would then be a next process that would include both immediate actions that, you know, that we could take right away, a near-term, set of goals, so that it didn't feel like this was going on forever, but then also a recognition a lot of this work is not something that's going to get done in a single effort or a single set of working groups, et cetera. So, so we did commit to kind of multiple timeframes, and so part of that concretely was to form some anti-Black racism work groups. And we have 3 work groups that were defined based on the recommendations of the Black study group, the initial fact finding, or, you know, kind of ecological evaluation of the department. And we're very close to getting those recommendations. And, you know, it feels like a year is a long time. And sometimes, you know, I have to remind myself, as I said, that, you know, I mean, the report, you know, really underlined this. This is a long-standing problem in our department. You know, despite, you know, certainly I can say from my own heart, despite my best intentions, like reading that report was heartbreaking to me. And so, you know, some of my reaction to it was really fighting against just a sense of despair in reading what it's like. And so I can't say enough what a gift, I agree, it was for people to be honest about what they were experiencing in the department. And you know, under any circumstances, I feel like it's our obligation to move forward on this. But I have to tell you, reading that report just made it, like, you know, inescapable. Like getting that kind of feedback and understanding what the experience is currently, not has been, not 50 years ago, right now in clinical situations, you know, day to day in our department that I really was blind to, really blind to. Despite caring a lot about this area. Sorry, uh, I, I didn't know, were you coming back to the,
Go
okay.
ahead.
So, the only other thing that I wanted to say, and then I'm interested in, I mean, you sat with it much longer than I was able to, obviously, when you were going through the data, and I really, this sort of tension between acknowledging like what a deep rooted problem this is and not losing hope, not, you know, not becoming nihilistic about, you know, about the power of structural racism and the inability to move that. You know, it's definitely something that I think about a lot, how we can make sure that we don't, you know, kind of give in to a sense of hopelessness about this. I did want to say that, you know, this was, I think in retrospect, and this panel has really, you know, forced me to think more about, you know, the decision making during that time. And on reflection, you know, I'm kind of sorry to say it was some of the most difficult decision making I've ever had as chair, as a leader. And that was in the midst of a pandemic, which was the most difficult, you know, decision making I'd ever had to do as a leader. But I felt less secure in my own judgment and my own understanding about what the problems were, about how to proceed on all of this. And so I have to say it was an unbelievable like stroke of good fortune that you and Lisa had arrived at the time that you had, that we'd had a chance to have dinner together. Because one of my first thoughts when I was thinking, oh my God, I didn't know what to do at all. I felt like if I asked Black faculty and staff to, to help me understand this, that's putting a tax on an incredibly small number of people in the department who, you know, I can't burden with this, but I don't know how to move forward without having a deeper understanding of this. So I just want to end by thanking you and Lisa again for at a really tough moment, just providing very kind of calm, open, accepting feedback about what I was struggling with and helping me kind of figure out as chair what I could do that would, you know, be constructive and I hope in the long run and move things forward.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you. And I think the things that worked were you know, you gave me authority to do this the way I envisioned it, and it did work the way I thought about it. You know, the way you know, the design was, you know, really aligned with my goals, and also, and then that good, clear demarcation of I'm going to get the information, but I'm not responsible for making things happen. That, you know, that's yours. And I didn't feel, I think there are ways that things feel taxing, and usually they're taxing when you have responsibility without any authority. And, you know, having some responsibility and specific, you know, I knew what my authority was and my responsibility in there. And, you know, I had a little bit of a budget to get help as I needed it. You know, those things all worked really well. And, you know, if there's anything that's taxing, it is, you know, it's kind of, it is sitting through that pain that, you know, people shared, to have that make me think about my own experiences in the past. You know, those are tough, you know, not, you know, they weren't in any way avoidable, but I think it was worth it. And, you know, what I want people to take away from is that what we're really agreeing to is continuing this conversation, not to get discouraged because the problem isn't solved. We are hundreds of years in. We're not going to solve it with one little, fact-finding mission. We need to keep talking about this. The goal is to keep improving policy and the climate here, and to really think about how we can heal some of the racial trauma that's going on in the department. And it's like, don't get tired, because, and that was my concern about, the also timing. We had to go quickly because people then will lose interest and they're not going to have that same commitment to this. But, I really want our department to commit to continuing the conversation, to continue to keep listening. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. And stay with us, Michelle. Rhonda and I are going to join you guys. And that was just amazing to hear. I think that in so many ways, everyone's in the same boat. We have a lot of white men leaders that are not experts in racism. And, I think asking the question the way you did, Matt. So, all of us were like, oh my God, is he going to ask some of our Black faculty? You can't do that. They can't say no to the chair. You can't burden our Black members more. There's just all this complexity. And so it was so good to hear about the trust that between you that made this work. And thank God you had an in-person dinner before COVID. Helps. So for me, a turning point was in the midst of trauma, and we have all been through so much trauma together, and to be part of a department that the chair, gets up and we start our meeting, our whole department meeting, and Matt, you said, we are not okay. We are not okay. And just that acknowledgement, just like opening the door to change. I know. So, that was in my head for months. We are not okay. And it's okay because we're calling it out and we see it. And this is, the beginning. What are we going to do? So this report was a very tailored question about this building, this program, this environment. And so my question to you guys is that, that's this open curiosity that gave us some answers and some directions. And is that something that you would suggest is doable? Michelle, you had a lot of years of training to create a mixed methods, quantitative, qualitative report.
I do think it's important, for other departments or, groups that might be thinking about doing something like this, that I do think it requires having knowledge about the theoretical bases of identity development and racism and legal issues, yes, all of those things. And that doesn't happen just because you might be a minority yourself. It's depending on where you are with your own identity, it can be challenging. And I think this is a question that requires that you really talk to people. So yes, I think it's important that we have those qualitative expertise as well.
And I have one more comment, and then I want to hear from Rhonda. I have felt so fortunate to be part of such a responsive conscious system, that our department most of all, but also the university responding in their own ways. So I took a mandatory champion diversity training, and we all have by now, most of us. And I thought, I came with thinking I knew, I'd heard this and I knew it. And I ended the meeting just crying with my eyes being open to that I was a passive white ally, and I understood what a real upstander is, which is speaking up and taking action when you see that racism is at work, and all of the from microaggression to clear aggression. And I thought of situations, particularly with trainees, when I didn't understand, and it was all so clear in retrospect. So it was this big review of how much I had failed certain people. And, of course I had shame and regret, and I couldn't go back. But the to now understand that I can be an upstander going forward. And, Matt, you are such a great white male upstander. And I know that's not an identity that you planned on, but, our department, we had so many executive meetings when you said, this is the first priority. So everyone understands, we're acting on the recommendations in the subcommittees. And that is, I feel so proud to be part of our department. I don't know what this would have been like without the kind of communal recognition of we are not okay and we're working together.
Yeah. And may just echo and really just respect and appreciate what you're sharing, Alyssa. The research does confirm that leadership and support of these initiatives is really, really important. It's not that we don't have power wherever we are and we don't have some ability to make some change. I want to just underscore that. We all have some power, whatever our role or our status, whatever our identity. And so a big part of this is really how do we rightly use the power that we have. But when we are in leadership, we have a particular degree of power and influence. And if we don't use it intentionally to support deepening capacity building to address these issues in this kind of ongoing way that you're speaking about as being necessary, we are using it for something else. In other words, silence around this issue teaches. Not standing up does its own, is its own training. And more than that, right? I mean, let's just say, I know it's not true here, but there are places where the leadership is actively hostile. And therefore, that's a kind of contagion. However verbalized this is, we know that hostility can be exuded in ways that are not verbal. You all know this as well as anybody or better. And so all of these things impact the environments that we're in. And so for those who are listening to this and just thinking about your own situation, having that ability to sort of really see clearly what we have in terms of resources, the agency that we have to make a difference, however small, from right where we are. But to have a kind of willingness to kind of reckon with, like, what is the situation in terms of willingness of those around me, those in power, and what can I do in light of all of that? And so I love that the project that you all have so beautifully kind of embodied and modeled really centers on this understanding that this is long-term work. We didn't get here in a generation, and we will not end these problems we live in cultures that want to end things in a semester in university system or a year or 5-year plan at the outset, maybe 20. But really, we're talking generations. We have to realize that that's one of the problems that we're dealing with, right? And that doesn't mean that we can't do anything, right? So how then do we meet what Dr. State was talking about, that tension between hopefulness that we can make a difference, but also the despair that can come from seeing the vastness of the cloth, seeing the great shape of the ocean or the river, right? Meeting these oceans. It's a lot. And so we do need a higher level of a kind of fortitude. We really do. And we really need to support ourselves and each other and kind of growing up in a certain way around this, because really, I think these questions need to really stay with us. How is it that we get to these places of high education authority and have not seen these issues as really germane and important? Where were we taught that these things weren't important for us and for our success? Because the reason why we have to keep asking that is because those trainings are still there. They're not going to go away just because we have this new commitment. So we really have to be on the lookout, as Alyssa was saying, to all these subtle ways that we might be called to stand up, and to also have that spirit of willingness to keep broadening the circles of concern and inquiry. So that, for example, I'm just going to name it. I have a UCSF patient, not in your particular department, but in the UCSF community for more than 20 years. I have had some experiences with this hospital. And as, again, a Black embodied woman whose heritage also is much more complicated than we're given to name, when I walk into that hospital, how am I read? As a cisgender, petite, brown-bodied, Black-bodied woman. And what has that meant for the kind of treatment I've gotten? Not in every instance, but in some instances, which have left me not feeling particularly respected and appreciated in those halls. So can our increase continue to that degree? We'll need that, because like as we said before, all of our professions, all of our disciplines are in for this reckoning, and in for, not for a penny, not even for a pound, but for a lifetime and the weight of all of that. And so I will just end by my piece right now by saying the thing that keeps me at this is that for me, it's not just unrelenting despair and confrontation with difficulty, right? Which we must turn toward if we're ever going to change. We have to. But doing it together is actually a source of, I mean, I have to say it, and some people think it sounds Pollyanna, but it's not. It's kind of joy, because we're actually doing these things. We are not, right, shrinking. We are not missing our power. We're standing up together and finding each other in a deeper, richer, more meaningful way in the life that we have. So I hope that people will feel a sense of inspiration and feel that even if you haven't experienced that in your own life, it's possible. It really is possible to have this really more fully human way of being with each other in these spaces and in these communities, and as we see each other on the street and work together. That's what my hope is here, that we can bring that deeper humanity. And that's the healing that I think we're really asking for, and that your work can help us inspire going forward.
Oh, I was muted. Thank you. That was so beautiful. I would love to end with a meditation, but first, any final thoughts or comments? And I'll just say mine, I revealed I didn't know what the difference between an ally and an upstander. And so now I at least have a goal and some examples. And I am so uncomfortable. This is such an important dialogue to be having. The question for everyone listening is, what is your reckoning? Can you start a dialogue in your home, work, institution that makes you uncomfortable? Because it's very uncomfortable. And that means when you feel that is good. That means you're starting to name things and open up things that may make us very uncomfortable. And I think so have sometimes started to use this sentence of, I'm working on my whiteness. And so, the ability to have some get out of jail cards and to be able to be just humble and start off with, I am surrounded by white privilege, and I stand in solidarity with my BIPOC brothers and sisters. I want to say that at the beginning of all these meetings, but it wouldn't quite fit in. But I think if we squeeze it in when we can. Matt and Michelle, any final comments before we sit with Rhonda?
Just really briefly, I just wanted to, the notion that that Rhonda brought up about sort of being able to work on this together, that thinking about this conversation it really was at a moment when so first of all, I have to say, even hearing about that this was a good thing to do, at the moment, it felt like literally the very least thing that I could do as you know, as a leader, again, with all the privilege that I have. And it's been gratifying in a number of ways, to find out that even though, you know, it felt like it was an absolutely important but small thing to do, because we're just a department of psychiatry in a school of medicine, that being able to work together and to see the way that people have been generous about sharing their experience and sharing their advice and being open to it and allowing me to be able to move, you know, into this space without being, you know, without pushing back in a way that, you know, clearly would have been reasonable. Like, you know, what, how come you didn't do this 8 years ago when you came to be chair, has been really valuable. And it was that group, and Lisa, and I also really want to mention Adri Ratno, who's my chief of staff, and Lisa Fortuna and other members of the leadership team, that without that group kind of coming together and saying, yeah, we'll take this, we'll help, we'll take this burden on together, we'll help you figure out what we can do as a department, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So it was very much, there was, and in an odd way, as you said, some sense of joy in being able to work with really generous, wise people in trying to sort out how to take one step in the right direction.
I agree much. This has been the best part of it, working together. And I have met so many new people who reach out to me and say, could I talk to you about, you know, diversity issues? It's like, yes, of course, that's great. We're keeping this conversation going. And yeah, it does give me hope. And there are times for discouragement. It's a good time to like give it a break so I can get some more energy and come back to it. So these work groups have been also a gift in the time we get to talk openly about these issues and then get to work about proposing our recommendations. So
beautiful, Michelle. Thank you so much, Michelle and Matt. And I think a word that I'm now adopting is active hope, which is not just hoping, but actually doing that work that also brings so much joy and purpose. And so we will leave it with you, Rhonda. Thank you so much for joining us. And now we get a few minutes to sit and together in our mind and body.
Yeah. And then the spirit of what was just named about our needing to restore and to take good care of ourselves as we do the work. If we can, just in these few moments that we have, recognizing that the time that we spend matters, and just sort of recognizing that within you that came into this conversation, and really seeing what that part of you really might need. What might your own personal reckoning look like? What might your own course of restoration and healing look like? What do you need, and what might you offer if you really were able to move with purpose into the call that you're hearing around this work at this time? So taking a moment to really lovingly allow whatever is coming up in response to that question to be met, if we are aware of the need that we have for more healing. Taking a deep breath, bringing a kind of gentle willingness to be present and to create space for at least acknowledging where we are, accepting where we are, that we're learning, or that we're wounded, or that we're stubborn, or that we're exhausted. Whatever it is that's coming up, if we can create space, taking a deep breath in and out, and see if you can invite a sense of, again, what brought you into this conversation, the goodness of that intention and of your own deep aspirations to make a difference around these issues. Breathing in and breathing out and letting yourself become aware of these deeper aspects of who you already are. And as we bring this meditation to a close, inviting a sense of appreciation for all that we are, a sense of compassionate will to alleviate our own suffering, but not only our own suffering, the suffering of others in our workplaces, our broader institutions, our communities, the world. So breathing in, sensing the capacity and strength and power we have to make a difference. And breathing out, relaxing, releasing, extending the wish for well-being, encompassing your whole body in this moment, and extending that beyond to those who really might need the support of this anti-racism, pro-equity focus, beginning right here, right now, for all of us. Thank you so much for your time, your practice, your spirit, your commitment, your brilliance.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And may the work continue.
May it be so.
Some great questions. I would like to welcome my fellow panelists back, Michelle, Rhonda, Matt. Some of the questions were about where's this report? What are you doing about it? So we will get to that. As you can see in the Q&A, the report is on our website, our webinar website, and you can make a quick read of the executive summary and absorb a lot. We posted the full report. You know, part of this is all about trying to be comfortable with the close-up look within. I'm wondering if Matt, Michelle, Rhonda, if you could join me.
I'm here. Hi.
Hi.
Good to see
Okay,
you.
I couldn't see you, so hopefully people could. I thought I was just waiting in the vacuum of Zoom. Okay, so some of the comments are just deep gratitude to all of you for what you've shared, for your vulnerability. There are comments on, this is such an important and courageous endeavor. This conversation is so precious. This is different. This is a bit different than things that I've heard. And people want to know more. There's a comment, where has this been all of my life? I've lived several generations already, experiences all sorts of things and types of discrimination. And Rhonda named it when she said, turn toward rather than away from these experiences. And so that inspired this person to keep that intention of turning toward. So I think the one quick, we want to talk about moving forward and steps that we're taking. And before I go there, I will say that people want to know more, Michelle and Matt, about how you worked from the discomfort of your own, any despair, any kind of feelings that came up around the report to move into action. And Michelle, was this report completely predictable to you, or were there any outcomes that surprised you?
Great question. Probably not surprising. Everything's relative. I've been in a number of different institutions, and I felt this one was addressing these issues in a better way than places I had been before. there's like, yes, I expect there's a certain level of experiences that are hurtful and harmful, but maybe not spoken about openly. And but it always, it's, I don't want to feel, I don't want to say I'm so unsurprised, because it always is like, ouch, I wish that wasn't there. I think one of the best things, that comes out of this is that people understand, well, if I don't hear about it, or if it doesn't affect me personally, it's not there. I think that this report really, hopefully does away with that, because once we realize that, this affects a lot of people in the department, and thus it affects the department, then, it's all of our responsibility to do something about it.
Matt, did you want to add anything?
Go. Yeah.
Sorry, Michelle.
Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I think part of the question was sort of how, well, I guess, was it a surprise? And it was surprising to me. And that raised a lot of mixed emotions about sort of that I shouldn't have been surprised, that I should have known more about what was happening. I think part of feeling like it was the right thing to do was that experience of reading it and being surprised, because it was doing exactly what I hoped, would happen in terms of really taking a deep dive and potentially opening up, the vista to things that that I'd been missing, that our leadership team had been missing. So it was, I think, probably much more surprising to me. Was there another part of the question?
Yeah, no, I think that's part of this process. I think there's a lot of interest in, what do I do now with this, your example? Does this report apply to other departments? And how do we start? Is it okay to turn to Black members of our faculty and to ask them to, to do a careful focus group like this? But let me just take one step back and ask you all if you want to comment on this. There are a lot of comments questioning the focus on anti-Black racism. And so what about, why not fold this into DEI? What about anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, other people of color?
I think all of those are incredibly important. We, absolutely, I think we're at a similar crisis point with anti-Asian hate crimes. I'm horrified, right? But and the idea is to use this as to use this as a model where we go in deep, we don't look away because this is uncomfortable. And we really understand that this is about white supremacy at its root. And if we can get that, then we can really apply these the processes and what we've learned more broadly to understand other types of discrimination. But if we've, turned too quickly, I think we will miss it. And I think that happens so often. We get a whataboutism. I've had a bad experience too, or the group I belong to. Let's really focus on this. Let's do this really well. And then let's expand. But we always, even in doing this, we did collect information about other types of discrimination. We found, sexism was something that was talked about a lot. And yes, there's intersectionality of, women who are Black and gay, and, all of these many different ways that we, feel these types of discriminations that are multiplicative and not just additive. But yes, that's the idea, that let's focus on this now, because we asked people to trust us and to talk. And remember, that's a big risk too, because many people have disclosed things that have happened to them, and then there were no consequences. That is really painful. So, just for people to take this in, sit with it, really listen to it, really think about it is a big deal.
Yes.
So, anyways,
We have about
lots
5
of-
minutes. I have 2
Go
more
ahead.
questions to fit in. Rhonda.
Just really quickly, in multicultural education, in kind of the work that I've been doing in law, which is drawn on what actually is critical race theory, which is very different from what people are talking about as critical race theory. My background really centers on what it means to build, to deepen our resources, to build our capacity for coalition building and working together across lines of real and perceived difference to make a difference. And so what we're talking about here then is being able to do some both and and I write about this, I use this language of, and I think, Michelle's comments were just alluding to it. We want to give time, because we can't have a world-sized analytical engagement with the whole world. We have to take time to focus in on particular aspects of what we're working with. So to say that we're spending time looking at anti-Black racism is not to say we're not it's not saying we're not interested in other things, nor are we unwilling to devote resources to looking more closely at the other aspects that are relevant. So, but it is about focusing in, spending time. I write about rotating the center of our concern. So recognizing, there are folks among us who are suffering in this area. Anti-Black racism has been a feature of American life and of life in San Francisco Bay Area, for one example, forever, since the founding. So how do we, who are members of this community, turn toward that issue as a means of supporting us, and then shifting our perspective to the next group that we also want to equally examine, and then work together for incorporation and coalition.
Thank you so much. My last 2 questions. One is to Rhonda and Michelle. What do you say to white leaders? What's the first step? How do you make the ask? And my last question will be to Matt. Give us some examples of some of the specific changes. How do we know we're moving and making progress? Okay, so for the first question, is it okay to ask your Black members to help? How do you ask? How do you not burden them with the ask?
I have to say, when Matt asked me, I had, completely believed his sincerity that I could say no. And that's important. If you can really invite someone and say, here's an opportunity, are you interested? And if you're interested, are you willing? And do you have the time? And, it's really important for me that if I can't do it, I can say no. But if you don't ask me and you assume for me, that's not okay. That doesn't feel good either. That's part of then an invisibility. If I can do something and I want to, I would like to be able to respond and participate.
Great points.
And I guess just to say, all of this is something that is calling us to kind of deepen our ability to kind of meet us right all where we are. Part of what we're doing is disrupting the trainings we have received about each other, assumptions we have about each other. Not all people who are in a Black or brown body are going to be equally willing or situated to do the kinds of work that Michelle, Dr. Portia has just described her doing, right? So it is the case that I think if we have the spirit of invitation, right, which I think was part of what was presented here, an invitation to be a part of this, not a request, an honoring of what it takes, the generosity of spirit that it can take to do this work, and rewarding it with time off or a course release in academia, right? Some way of recognizing that this isn't free work, right? Not asking people to do labor on top of labor, ideally, because if that's happening, that's another manifestation of the inequity.
Yes, thank you so much, Rhonda. Matt, how much does this report apply possibly to other departments? What would you suggest to your members? And what are some of the specific steps that we're taking in our department? Let's see.
Oh,
Okay.
every Zoom meeting, I have to do that at least once. I'll do the second verse. So, you know, when we charged this study, there was already a notion that there would be multiple levels of work, that if there were immediate things that we could do, that we would take those recommendations, try to act on them. That we definitely felt that there was, I mean, part of the whole process of asking and knowing that there was a burden, significant burden related to that, was to separate out the report from some of the work that we knew would come immediately after that around developing working groups. And so those have started and are very close to providing recommendations, and are a really important step in setting a path forward for the department. And then there's just a third recognition that this is not going to be a week, a month, a year. This needs to be a long-term investment for the department. And what I would say about how far we've gotten is that we've followed that plan. But I'd ask you and Michelle, because that's the important thing. Does it feel like things are moving? Does it feel like it was worthwhile to engage in this? And we're never going to have made enough progress, but is there enough to feel like we're headed in the right direction?
Yeah, I feel a complete shift of culture and priorities. And frustration that changing things takes so long, hiring takes so long. How do we recruit Black colleagues when we have so few? How can we make it a warm, receptive place when they can see their representation is low, and in some areas, departments, programs, divisions, none. They're going to come in and be the only Black person. How can we make them feel belonging and included? So it's a big discussion and challenge to keep up. But I do feel like our eyes are open, the door is open, and we're actively starting this process of changing the pipeline and changing recruitment. Michelle.
Yeah, I do think that people are thoughtful in a different way when you're thinking about hiring. I see a lot of energy to, try to get specific hires that would really have benefited the department. Sometimes we don't have control over that, who says yes or no, but I see the energy in trying to attract more people, students, trainees. Those are really important issues. We've started this conversation and we can't go back now. So it's going to be slow, but we're still engaged, and I think that that's really important.
Beautiful. And my last quick question for Rhonda, you coach leaders on this process of change. You probably find them in different stages, but do you have any observations or advice from that work?
Really, I just think that, again, we might have to start where we are, and really looking at where we are and where our strengths and weaknesses are and how we got them. In other words, to see where we might still be subject to the circumstances, the contexts, structures, and the circumstances that re-embed turning away, right? So really developing that kind of stamina, as opposed to the thing we're hearing about, fragility. If we can actually really, again, feel the strength of our ability and support ourselves in growing up to that extent, to be able to look at these areas where we have been trained not to do this work, frankly. We've actually been rewarded. We set up reward structures against actually changing the circumstances we find ourselves in around these embedded hierarchies. And it helps to have support. It really, really does help to have communities of support, one colleague that you can trust. So I'm hopeful that as we continue doing work like this, we are building out the infrastructure of support, interpersonal, and then more collectively, for doing this kind of change in some measure for the rest of our lives. I think if we can start to see that this is what it means to be, really engaged in the 21st century challenges that include everything from anti-racism touching all our lives and communities in different subgroups to climate change and healthcare policy, public health crises. All of these problems are opportunities for us to really grow up in the direction of working together across these lines of real and perceived differences amongst human communities. And we have to do that if we're going to survive. So, I'm hopeful that, there are resources out there. I put my website there. I'll drop a link to my book, which is one place where I offer practices and more advice for how we start from where we are, how we start from supporting ourselves and having a reckoning with ourselves. And from there, doing the work that we need to do in an ongoing way.
So beautiful, Rhonda. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you for being such leaders in this work and helping us all turn toward and not away. And we need to do that together. And that's what I see happening. And that does give me so much hope and meaning and purpose to be part of it. Thanks to everyone for sticking with us. We went a little bit over, but
thank you, Dr. Ethel. Thank you, Alyssa, for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.